Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The van's engine wheezed like an old man climbing stairs, each gear shift accompanied by a grinding sound that made my teeth ache. I pressed my face against the cool window, watching the endless expanse of desert roll past in the pale moonlight. The cracked vinyl seat beneath me had seen better days, probably decades better, and the stuffing poked through in uncomfortable lumps that dug into my back no matter how I positioned myself. Mom's hands gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her wedding ring catching the dashboard lights as we hit another pothole. The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon, cutting through the Navajo reservation with surgical precision. No streetlights, no other cars. Just us and the vast emptiness that seemed to swallow our headlight beams. "How much further?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be vague. "A while yet," Mom replied, her voice tight with concentration. The radio had given up on us an hour ago, dissolving into static that sounded like angry whispers. She'd finally snapped it off in frustration, leaving us with only the sound of wind buffeting the van's sides and the occasional ping of gravel against the undercarriage. The silence stretched between us, heavy and expectant. Outside, the desert landscape looked alien in the moonlight, twisted shapes of sagebrush casting long shadows, rock formations that resembled sleeping giants, and the occasional glint of something metallic or reflective that vanished as soon as our headlights swept past. I'd made this trip with Mom before, but never this late at night. Usually, we'd drive during the day when the desert looked less threatening, when you could see for miles in every direction and feel reasonably sure about what was out there. Now, everything beyond our small bubble of light remained unknown, unknowable. The van hit another rough patch, and I heard something rattle loose in the back. Mom's toolbox, probably, or maybe one of the water jugs we'd brought for emergencies. The sound made me jump, my nerves already frayed from staring into the darkness for too long. "You okay back there?" Mom asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. Her eyes looked tired, strained from squinting at the road. "Yeah, it's really dark out here." She nodded, understanding. "It gets darker before it gets lighter. That's what your grandmother used to say." Her voice softened at the mention of my grandmother, who'd grown up on this reservation, who'd known every mile of these roads before they were paved. The van lurched suddenly as Mom swerved around something in the road. A dead animal, maybe, or just debris. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. The darkness seemed to press closer to the windows, as if it were a living thing trying to get in. "Tell me a story," I said suddenly, desperate for distraction. "One of Grandma's stories." Mom was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight I hadn't expected. "Your Aunt Emma used to love coming out here at night," she began. "Before she got married, before she moved to the city, she and her friends would drive these roads looking for adventure." I settled back in my seat, grateful for anything that would take my mind off the oppressive darkness surrounding us. But something in Mom's tone suggested this wouldn't be the kind of lighthearted story I was hoping for. Mom's fingers drummed against the steering wheel in a nervous rhythm as she seemed to wrestle with whether to continue. The van's headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead. But beyond that cone of light, the world disappeared entirely. No stars were visible through the thick cloud cover, making the night feel enclosed, suffocating. "Mom?" I prompted when the silence stretched too long. She took a deep breath, the kind that suggested she was about to share something she'd rather keep buried. "Your Aunt Emma. She saw things out here. Things that don't make sense in the daylight." A chill that had nothing to do with the van's broken air conditioning crept down my arms. What kind of things? The kind your grandmother warned us about. Mom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The kind that remind you this land is older than our understanding of it. I leaned forward, straining to hear over the van's labored breathing. Outside, the landscape had grown even more desolate. No houses, no lights, not even fence posts to break up the endless expanse of scrub and stone. Grandma always said there are places where the membrane between worlds grows thin, Mom continued. Places where things that shouldn't exist can slip through. Your Aunt Emma found one of those places. The van hit a series of small bumps, and each jolt sent a vibration through my bones. I found myself checking the locks on the doors, though what I thought I was keeping out, I couldn't say. This was back when Emma was 22, wild and fearless. She had this group of friends, city kids mostly, who thought the reservation was exotic, mysterious. They'd drive out here on weekends with coolers full of beer and cheap wine, looking for places to party where no adults would bother them. Mom paused to navigate around a particularly nasty pothole. In the brief moment when she took her foot off the gas, the engine's noise died down, and I could hear something else. A low whistling sound that might have been wind, but didn't quite sound natural. They found this spot, Mom continued once we were back up to speed. Maybe 15 miles from where we are now. A little valley between two hills, hidden from the main road. Perfect for their purposes. Isolated, private, with flat ground for parking and a natural windbreak. I tried to picture it. Young people laughing and drinking under the stars. Music playing from someone's car stereo. The kind of innocent fun that seemed impossible in the oppressive atmosphere surrounding us now. They went there 3 weekends in a row without any problems, Mom said. Emma told me it felt like their secret place, somewhere that belonged to them. But on the 4th weekend, something was different. The van's engine coughed, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we might break down out here in the middle of nowhere. But it caught again, settling back into its labored rhythm. Different how? I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Mom's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting mine for just a moment before returning to the road. Emma said the air felt wrong, heavy, like before a thunderstorm, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The others felt it too. The conversation died down, the laughter got forced. Even the music sounded muffled, like the desert was swallowing the sound. I found myself scanning the darkness outside our windows, looking for any sign of the valley Mom was describing. The thought of our van breaking down near such a place made my stomach clench with anxiety. They should have left then, Mom said, her voice carrying the weight of hindsight. Should have packed up their things and driven back to town. But they were young, and they'd already opened the bottles, and leaving would have meant admitting they were scared of nothing more than shadows and silence. The van crested a small hill, and for a moment our headlights swept across a wider vista of desert. In that brief illumination, I saw something that made my breath catch, a cluster of shapes in the distance that might have been buildings or vehicles, or something else entirely. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but darkness. So they stayed, Mom continued, either not noticing my reaction or choosing to ignore it. And that's when Emma's real story begins. Mom slowed the van as we approached a sharp curve, the headlights sweeping across a landscape that seemed to shift and change in the moving light. What had looked like solid ground a moment before now revealed itself to be scattered with deep shadows and unexpected drops. The road itself seemed narrower here, the painted lines faded to almost nothing. Emma's group had this ritual, Mom began, her voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. Every time they came out here, they'd park in a circle, 5 or 6 cars, headlights pointing inward to create a makeshift dance floor in the middle. Jake would bring his portable stereo, the kind with the big speakers that could blast music loud enough to hear from a mile away. I could picture it, teenagers and young adults freed from the constraints of town life, music echoing off the desert rocks, the kind of reckless abandon that only comes with youth and darkness and the illusion of invincibility. But this fourth night, when they tried to arrange the cars, something felt wrong immediately. The ground that had been perfectly level before seemed uneven now, forcing them to park at awkward angles. Two of the cars couldn't get their headlights to work properly. Jake's kept flickering on and off, and Emma's friend Diana couldn't get hers to turn on at all. The van's engine hiccuped, and Mom pumped the gas pedal gently, coaxing it back to a steady rhythm. They managed to get enough light to set up their usual party spot, but it felt forced, artificial. The music sounded thin in the desert air, swallowed up by the vastness before it could create any real atmosphere. I pressed my face against the side window, trying to see past our own reflection in the glass. The darkness outside seemed to have weight and substance, pressing against the van like deep water. Emma said the first sign of real trouble came when they realized they weren't alone. Mom's voice dropped, and I had to strain to hear her over the engine noise. At first, it was just a feeling. You know how sometimes you can sense someone watching you, even when you can't see them? That prickly sensation between your shoulder blades that makes you want to turn around? I knew the feeling well, and had been experiencing it for the past hour as we drove through this empty landscape. The knowledge that I wasn't the only one who'd felt it was somehow both comforting and terrifying. They all felt it at the same time, Mom continued. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. The laughter died away. Even the music seemed to quiet itself, as if the stereo was responding to the same instinct that had silenced the group. She paused to navigate around what looked like a small landslide. Rocks and debris scattered across half the road. Our wheels crunched over the smaller stones, the sound abnormally loud in the confined space of the van. Emma was the first one to say it out loud. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" And immediately, everyone started looking around, peering into the darkness beyond their circle of light. But there was nothing to see, just the same empty desert they'd been partying in for weeks. I found myself doing the same thing, scanning the darkness outside our van for any sign of movement, any shape that didn't belong. The constant motion of sagebrush in the wind created an endless series of false alarms, shadows that seemed to shift and dart just at the edge of perception. That's when they heard the first sound, Mom said. A sharp crack, like someone stepping on a dry branch. It came from somewhere outside their circle of cars, from the darkness they couldn't penetrate. My hands had unconsciously clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. What did they do? "What would you do?" Mom asked, glancing at me in the mirror. They turned up the music, opened another round of drinks, and tried to pretend they hadn't heard anything. Young people that age, they don't want to admit they're scared. Admitting fear means admitting they might not be as grown-up and independent as they think they are. The van's headlights suddenly illuminated a road sign, weathered and bullet-holed, but still readable. "Entering sacred lands," it read. "Respect this place." Below that, in smaller text that was harder to make out, "Some areas off limits after dark." But the sounds kept coming, Mom continued, either not seeing the sign or choosing not to comment on it. Not regular, like an animal moving through the brush. Random, deliberate, like someone or something was moving in a wide circle around their campsite, taking their time, staying just far enough out that the car headlights couldn't reach them. I realized I'd been holding my breath and forced myself to exhale slowly. The van felt smaller now, more vulnerable, like a tiny island of safety in an ocean of potential threat. Emma tried to convince herself it was just wildlife. Coyotes, maybe, or wild dogs drawn by the smell of food. but deep down, she knew it was something else. The sounds were too calculated, too purposeful. Animals move with natural rhythms. This was different. As if summoned by Mom's words, something darted across the road directly in front of us. Mom hit the brakes hard, and we both lurched forward against our seatbelts. In the brief moment when our headlights caught it, I saw a shape that might have been a dog or coyote, but moved with an unsettling, almost human gait. "Did you see that?" I gasped. Mom nodded grimly. "Welcome to Aunt Emma's world," she said, and pressed down on the accelerator again. The van's engine seemed to strain harder as we continued deeper into the reservation. The road here was in worse condition. More cracks, more potholes, and a disturbing tendency to curve back on itself as if it had been designed by someone who wanted travelers to become disoriented. Every now and then, our headlights would catch a reflective marker or road sign, but the text was often in Navajo, leaving me to wonder what warnings we might be missing. The sounds around Emma's group got bolder, Mom continued, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. What had started as occasional snapping branches became a steady pattern of movement. Footsteps, maybe, or something dragging across the ground. But still from that same distance, just beyond the reach of their lights. I could feel my heart beating faster, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the van's struggling engine. Outside, the landscape had become even more alien. Twisted rock formations that looked almost intentionally sculptured. Clusters of dead trees that resembled skeletal hands reaching toward the clouded sky. "Jake, he was the one with the stereo. Finally got fed up with the whole thing," Mom said. "He grabbed one of the big flashlights they'd brought and announced he was going to find out what was making all the noise." "Probably just some mangy coyote," he said. "I'll scare it off and we can get back to having fun." The van hit a particularly bad bump, and I heard something fall over in the back. The sound made me jump, my nerves stretched taut as wire. The others tried to talk him out of it, but Jake was the kind of guy who never backed down from a challenge. 23 years old, played football in high school, thought he was tough enough to handle anything the desert could throw at him. He switched on that big flashlight and walked toward where they'd been hearing the sounds. I found myself leaning forward, caught up in the story despite my growing unease. What happened to him? "That's just it," Mom said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Nothing happened. He walked maybe 50 yards out from their circle of cars, swinging that flashlight back and forth, calling out, 'Here, boy,' like he was looking for a lost dog. The beam swept across empty desert, nothing but rocks and brush and the occasional piece of trash blown in from the highway. She paused to navigate around what looked like a washout where recent rains had carved a small gully across the asphalt. The van's suspension groaned as we dropped into the depression and climbed out the other side. But Emma said that's when she noticed something that made her skin crawl. The sounds had stopped completely. Not gradually, like an animal moving away. Instantly. The moment Jake stood up with that flashlight, everything went dead silent. No footsteps, no rustling, no snapping branches. Just Jake's voice echoing off the rocks and coming back hollow and strange. I glanced at the van's clock. We'd been driving for over 3 hours now, and the fuel gauge was starting to worry me. But asking Mom about it seemed like the wrong thing to do while she was deep in Emma's story. Jake came back to the group acting all triumphant, saying he'd scared off whatever it was. But Emma could tell he was rattled. His hands were shaking when he put the flashlight down, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to follow him back. The van's headlights suddenly illuminated something ahead that made my stomach lurch. A cluster of abandoned vehicles pulled off to the side of the road. 3 or 4 cars and trucks in various stages of decay, stripped of useful parts and left to rust in the desert air. Some had their hoods up, others sat on bare rims, and one truck was missing its entire front end. "Car graveyard," Mom said, noticing my stare. "People break down out here more often than you'd think. If they can't get a tow truck to come this far out, sometimes they just abandon them." The sight of those dead vehicles made our own van feel even more fragile, more vulnerable. What would happen if our engine finally gave up? How long would we have to wait for help in this desolate place? After Jake's little expedition, Emma's group tried to get back to their party, Mom continued. But the mood was broken. The music sounded forced, the laughter was nervous, and everyone kept glancing toward the darkness beyond their ring of light. They'd finish one drink and immediately open another, trying to blur the edges of their fear. I could understand that impulse. Even sitting safely inside the van with Mom, I found myself wishing I could somehow make the darkness less oppressive, less full of hidden possibilities. That's when they started hearing the new sound, Mom said. Not footsteps this time, but something worse. A scraping noise, like fingernails on metal, coming from somewhere above them. Despite myself, I glanced up at the van's ceiling. The metal was dented and stained with age, but it looked solid enough. Still, the thought of something clinging to the roof while we drove made my skin crawl. Emma said it started soft, almost musical. A gentle scratching that could have been branches scraping against one of the cars. But it got louder, more insistent, and definitely more deliberate. Like something was testing the strength of the metal, looking for a way in. The van's engine coughed violently, and for a terrifying moment I thought it might die completely. But it caught itself and resumed its labored rhythm, though it sounded worse than before. "Please tell me they left then," I said, though I suspected the story was far from over. Mom shook her head grimly. They tried to. Emma was already moving toward her car keys when the scraping sound suddenly multiplied. Instead of one source, now it seemed to come from everywhere. The roofs of all their cars, the hoods, even the ground around their feet. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. Outside our van, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, full of shadows and hidden places where anything might be waiting. And that, Mom said, is when they realized they were completely surrounded. Our van shuddered as Mom downshifted to climb a steep grade, the engine whining with effort. The road here carved through a narrow canyon, with rock walls rising on both sides and cutting off any view of the horizon. Our headlights bounced off the stone faces, creating a tunnel of light that somehow made the darkness ahead seem even more impenetrable. Emma said the scraping sounds were everywhere now, Mom continued, raising her voice slightly over the engine noise. Not just random scratching, but coordinated, purposeful, like invisible fingers drumming out a rhythm on every surface. The car hoods, the trunks, the windows. Even the ground around their feet seemed to echo with tiny tapping sounds. I pressed my hands against my ears instinctively, trying to block out sounds that existed only in Mom's story. But the van's own noises, the grinding engine, the rattling windows, the occasional ping of debris against the undercarriage, began to take on sinister qualities, as if our vehicle was experiencing its own supernatural assault. The group huddled together in the center of their circle, backs pressed against each other, trying to watch all directions at once, Mom said. But there was nothing to see. The scraping and tapping continued, growing louder and more aggressive. But their flashlights revealed only empty desert. We crested the hill and began descending the other side. The canyon opened up again, revealing a landscape that looked somehow different from what we'd been driving through before. The rocks here were darker, more jagged, and arranged in formations that seemed almost intentional, like ancient monuments or warning markers. That's when Jake made his second mistake, Mom said. He grabbed a tire iron from his trunk and started shouting at the darkness. "Show yourself," he kept yelling. "Whatever you are, come out where we can see you." He swung that tire iron over his head, challenging something he couldn't even identify. The van's headlights swept across a road sign so faded I couldn't read it, but the bullet holes in it were clearly visible. Someone had used it for target practice, leaving it pockmarked with small dark holes that looked like eyes in the brief moment they were illuminated. Emma tried to calm Jake down, but he was past listening, The fear had transformed into anger, and he was looking for something concrete to fight against. He climbed up on the hood of his car, still waving that tire iron, still shouting challenges at the invisible whatever it was. I found myself imagining the scene. A young man silhouetted against car headlights, brandishing a weapon at empty air while his friends watched in growing terror. It would have been almost comical if not for the context Mom had built around it. The scraping sound stopped the moment Jake climbed up on his car, Mom said. Complete silence, just like before when he'd walked out with the flashlight. Emma said the quiet was worse than the noise had been. It felt expectant, like the calm before a storm. The van's engine began making a new sound, a rhythmic clicking that seemed to come from directly overhead. I glanced up at the ceiling panels, searching for any sign of damage or loose parts, but saw nothing unusual. Jake stood on that hood for maybe 30 seconds, tire iron raised over his head, shouting into the silence. Then something landed on the roof of Emma's car with a thud that shook the entire vehicle. My heart hammered against my ribs. The clicking sound from our own roof was getting louder, more insistent. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you hear that clicking?" She nodded without taking her eyes off the road. "Probably just a loose roof rack. The wind gets under it and makes it flutter." But we didn't have a roof rack. Emma said whatever landed on her car was heavy, Mom continued, either not noticing my distress or choosing to push through with the story. Heavy enough to make the whole vehicle bounce on its springs. And then it started moving, not walking, but sliding, like something was dragging itself across the metal surface. The clicking from our roof intensified, developing a rhythm that sounded almost like footsteps. I gripped the armrest so tightly my knuckles went white. The sliding sound moved from the back of Emma's car toward the front, slow and deliberate. Emma was inside, crouched down in the driver's seat, key in the ignition but too terrified to turn it. She said she could feel the car rock slightly with each movement above her. Our van hit a pothole and the clicking stopped for a moment, then resumed, louder than before. Jake jumped down from his own hood and ran toward Emma's car, tire iron still in hand. But before he could reach it, something else landed on the roof of another vehicle. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, all 6 cars in their circle had something heavy and invisible moving around on their roofs. I couldn't stand it anymore. "Mom, we need to pull over. There's definitely something on our roof." She glanced at me in the rearview mirror, and I saw my own fear reflected in her eyes. "There's nowhere safe to pull over out here," she said. "We keep driving until we reach town." The clicking evolved into a scraping sound, long fingernails dragging across metal. It moved from the center of the roof toward the front of the van, directly above the windshield. "Emma finally got her car started," Mom said, her voice tight with strain. "But when she tried to drive away, the thing on her roof held on. She could hear it scrambling for purchase as the car accelerated, claws or fingers scraping against the metal. A shadow passed across our windshield, something dark moving between us and the moonlight. I looked up through the glass but saw nothing except clouds. The others tried to follow Emma, but whatever was on their roofs wasn't letting go easily. Diana's car stalled out completely, and when she finally got it running again, she could hear something pounding on the metal above her head, like it was angry about being jostled. The scraping on our roof moved to the passenger side, then toward the back. I twisted in my seat, trying to follow the sound, but it was impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Emma made it maybe half a mile before she realized the thing was still with her, Mom said. The scraping had stopped, but she could feel the extra weight, the way the car handled differently with something heavy clinging to the roof. Our van lurched suddenly as Mom swerved around something in the road. In the brief moment when our headlights swept to the side, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a human figure standing in the desert, perfectly motionless. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. That's when Emma made the mistake of looking up, Mom said. The scraping on our van's roof had developed a pattern now. 3 long scratches, pause, 3 more scratches, pause. It sounded like someone trying to get our attention, testing our response, seeing how long they could torment us before we cracked. Mom's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but she kept driving, eyes fixed rigidly ahead. Emma couldn't help herself, Mom continued, her voice barely audible over the engine noise and the horrible scraping above us. She knew she shouldn't look up, knew that seeing whatever was on her roof would make everything worse, but the human mind has limits to what it can ignore. I understood completely. Every instinct screamed at me to crane my neck and peer through the sunroof we didn't have, to try to catch a glimpse of whatever was creating that methodical, deliberate sound above our heads. She tilted her head back while she drove, just a quick glance through the moonroof of her car. At first, she saw nothing, just the dark outline of something pressed against the glass from the outside. But then it moved, shifting its weight. And Emma found herself staring up into a face that wasn't quite human. The scraping on our roof stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been, filling the van with a tension so thick I could barely breathe. Emma slammed on her brakes without thinking, Mom said. Pure reflex. The car skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust, and whatever was on the roof lost its grip and went sliding forward across the hood. Our van was climbing another hill now, the engine laboring harder than ever. I could smell something burning, oil maybe, or overheated metal. The dashboard lights flickered ominously. For just a moment, the thing was visible in her headlights as it tumbled off the front of the car. Emma got a clear look at what had been stalking their group, and she told me later that she wished she'd kept her eyes on the road. I held my breath, waiting for the description, dreading it. It looked like a person at first glance, Mom said slowly. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head in roughly the right place. But something was wrong with the proportions. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head tilted at an angle that suggested the neck was broken or twisted. The burning smell was getting stronger. Steam began rising from under our hood, visible in the headlight beams. And the skin, Mom continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Emma said it looked like leather that had been left in the sun too long, dark, cracked, hanging loose in some places, and stretched tight in others. But the worst part was the eyes. Too large, too bright, reflecting the headlights like an animal's, but with an intelligence behind them that was purely human. Our engine made a sound like a dying animal and began losing power. We were near the top of the hill, but the van was slowing despite Mom's attempts to coax more speed from it. The thing rolled to its feet with impossible grace, Mom said, even as our own situation became increasingly desperate. Not like someone who'd just fallen off a moving car, but like someone who'd planned the whole thing. It stood in Emma's headlight beams for maybe 5 seconds, staring directly at her through the windshield, and Emma said she could see it thinking, calculating, deciding what to do next. The van's engine died completely just as we reached the crest of the hill. We coasted forward for a few more yards before Mom guided us to the side of the road, our headlights pointing down into a valley that seemed to stretch forever into the darkness. Mom, I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. The engine's dead. She turned the key, and the starter made a grinding sound, but wouldn't catch. I know, honey, I know. The silence that followed was absolute. No engine noise, no radio static, no wind. Even the scraping on the roof had stopped. We sat in our powerless van at the top of a hill in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness that seemed to press against the windows like deep water. What happened to Emma? I whispered. The thing started walking toward her car, Mom said, her voice barely audible. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with that same calculated grace. Emma panicked and threw her car in reverse, backing away as fast as she could without using her lights. She turned the key again. This time, the engine coughed and caught, running rough but running. The headlights flickered back to life, revealing the empty road ahead. But when she looked in her rearview mirror, Mom continued as we began rolling down the hill, she saw that the others hadn't been so lucky. Through our windshield, the desert valley spread out below us like a dark ocean, and scattered across that emptiness, barely visible in the distance, were lights. Not house lights or street lamps, but the erratic flickering of car headlights, as if several vehicles were driving in chaotic patterns with no apparent destination. Emma could see her friends' cars in the distance behind her, headlights weaving back and forth across the desert like they were trying to escape from something. But whatever had been on the roofs wasn't giving up easily. The lights in the valley seemed to be getting closer, or maybe we were just descending toward them. Either way, I could now make out individual beams sweeping across the landscape in frantic, desperate patterns. Diana's car was spinning in circles, like she couldn't control the steering. The headlights would sweep across the desert, illuminate something Emma couldn't quite make out, then jerk away as if Diana was trying to avoid looking at whatever was out there. Our van was picking up speed as we descended, and Mom had to brake to keep us under control. The engine was running smoother now, but the burning smell hadn't gone away. Jake's truck was racing straight toward the highway, but Emma could see something dark clinging to his roof, something that shifted and moved as the vehicle bounced over the rough terrain. The lights in the valley were definitely getting closer now. I could see at least 6 separate sets of headlights, all moving in erratic patterns that suggested their drivers were either drunk, terrified, or no longer in complete control of their vehicles. That's when Emma realized she had to make a choice. Mom said, try to help her friends and risk whatever had been hunting them, or save herself and live with the guilt. We reached the bottom of the hill, and I could see that the valley was much larger than it had appeared from above. The scattered headlights were still miles away, but they seemed to be converging on our location, drawn by our own lights like moths to a flame. What did she choose? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. She chose to survive, Mom said simply. And she spent the last 15 years wondering if she made the right decision. The valley floor was rougher than the hill roads had been, with patches of deep sand that made the van's wheels spin and fishtail. Mom fought to maintain control as we navigated between scattered boulders and the occasional deep wash carved by flash floods. The engine was running hot, steam still rising from under the hood, but it was running. Emma drove for her life, Mom continued, her voice tight with concentration as she steered around a particularly treacherous patch of loose rock. No headlights, navigating by moonlight alone, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever had been stalking their group. The lights behind us were definitely getting closer now. What had seemed like random movement from a distance now revealed itself to be a coordinated pursuit. The scattered headlight beams were converging on our position, moving faster than any normal vehicle should be able to travel across this terrain. She made it maybe 5 miles before her car broke down, Mom said. Overheated engine, just like ours is doing now. She coasted to a stop in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no engine. Nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat and the wind whistling through the rocks. I could relate to that feeling all too well. Our own engine was making increasingly alarming noises, and the temperature gauge had climbed into the red zone. We were maybe 10 minutes away from being stranded ourselves. Emma sat in that dead car for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of pursuit, Mom continued. No engine sounds, no voices, nothing but the normal night sounds of the desert. She started to think she might have escaped, that whatever had been hunting them couldn't follow her this far. The pursuing lights had spread out now, forming a wide net that seemed designed to prevent escape. They were still several miles back, but closing the distance steadily. I could see now that there were more than 6 sets of headlights, maybe a dozen or more, all moving in perfect coordination. That's when she heard the scratching on her roof again. Mom said. Soft at first, like fingernails gently testing the strength of the metal. Then harder, more insistent, as if whatever was up there was trying to claw its way inside. Our van lurched as we hit a deep pothole, and something fell over in the back with a crash. The sound made me jump, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. Emma tried to restart her car, but the engine was completely dead. She was trapped in a metal box with something on the roof that was getting more aggressive by the minute. The scratching became pounding, then scraping, then a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard as whatever it was tried to find a way in. The pursuing lights had gained significant ground while Mom was talking. They were maybe 3 miles back now, close enough that I could see they weren't moving like normal vehicles at all. They seemed to drift and weave across the landscape without regard for terrain, maintaining perfect formation even as they navigated around obstacles that should have forced them to spread out. Emma made the decision to run, Mom said. She grabbed her keys, took a deep breath, and threw open the car door. The thing on the roof immediately scrambled to the edge, trying to see where she'd gone, and Emma got her first clear look at what had been hunting them. Our engine coughed violently and began losing power again. Mom pumped the gas pedal, but we were definitely slowing down. It was human-shaped but wrong in every detail, Mom continued, even as our situation became increasingly desperate. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions that should have been impossible. Its skin looked like old leather, cracked and weathered, and its eyes reflected light like an animal's. But the most disturbing thing was its intelligence. Emma could see it thinking, planning, adapting its strategy to her actions. We were down to maybe 15 miles per hour now, crawling across the desert floor while the lights behind us closed in rapidly. They were close enough now that I could see they cast no beams, just floating points of illumination that revealed nothing about what was carrying them. Emma ran, Mom said simply. No plan, no destination, just pure terror driving her across the desert on foot. She could hear the thing following her, not running, but moving with that same disturbing grace she'd seen when it rolled off her car. Our engine died completely, and this time it didn't restart when Mom turned the key. We coasted to a stop in the middle of the valley, surrounded by darkness that seemed to have weight and substance. "What happened to her?" I whispered. "She ran until her lungs gave out, then hid behind a boulder and waited for dawn," Mom said. When the sun came up, she was alone. No sign of the thing that had been chasing her, no sign of her car, no sign of her friends. She walked 15 miles to the nearest road and hitchhiked back to town. The pursuing lights had formed a circle around us, maybe half a mile out in all directions. They hung motionless in the darkness like predatory eyes, waiting. "Did she ever find out what happened to the others?" I asked. 3 of the cars were found a week later, Mom said quietly. Empty, abandoned in different locations across the reservation. No sign of the people who'd been driving them. Jake's truck was never found at all. The circle of lights began moving closer, tightening around our disabled van like a noose. I could see now that there were dozens of them, far more than could be accounted for by Emma's missing friends. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I think we're in Emma's Valley." She nodded grimly and reached for the door handle. "Then we better start running." The desert air hit my lungs like ice water when I stepped out of the van. Without the buffer of metal and glass, the silence was absolute. No insects, no wind, not even the distant hum of traffic from an unseen highway. Just the sound of my own breathing and the rapid beating of my heart. Mom came around from the driver's side, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone trying not to attract attention. The circle of lights had stopped advancing, but they remained motionless around us. A perfect ring of unblinking surveillance that stretched as far as I could see in every direction. "Stay close to me," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive quiet. "Don't run unless I tell you to run, and if I tell you to run, don't look back." We began walking away from the van, heading toward what I hoped was the direction of the main road. The desert floor was treacherous in the darkness, loose rocks, hidden depressions, and thorny vegetation that caught at our clothes and scratched exposed skin. Every step felt like a gamble, and I found myself placing my feet with exaggerated care to avoid making any sound. Emma told me the hardest part wasn't the running, Mom whispered as we picked our way across the landscape. It wasn't even being chased by something that shouldn't exist. The hardest part was the waiting afterward, the not knowing what had happened to her friends. Behind us, I heard the van's doors creak open and slam shut in sequence, as if someone was systematically checking each one. But when I glanced back, I saw only our abandoned vehicle sitting alone in the darkness, surrounded by that ring of motionless lights. She went back during the day, Mom continued, helping me navigate around a cluster of barrel cacti. Drove out to where they'd been camping, looking for some sign of what had happened. But there was nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, no evidence that 6 cars and a dozen people had ever been there. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I realized the lights were moving again. Not toward us, but maintaining their relative positions as we traveled, like a pack of wolves shadowing prey from a safe distance. The knowledge that we were being followed, herded, maybe, made my skin crawl. The authorities weren't interested in her story, Mom said, her breathing becoming more labored as we climbed over a low ridge. Missing persons reports were filed, but no one believed Emma's account of what had happened. Too fantastic, too unbelievable. They figured it was a drug deal gone wrong, or kids playing pranks that got out of hand. At the top of the ridge, we paused to rest and get our bearings. The main road was visible in the distance, a black ribbon marked by the occasional passing headlight. It looked impossibly far away, but it was our only hope of reaching civilization. Emma spent years trying to find them, Mom continued as we began descending the other side of the ridge. She hired private investigators, searched through missing persons databases, even consulted with traditional healers who might understand what they'd encountered. But it was like her friends had simply ceased to exist. One of the lights broke from the circle and began moving directly toward us, closing the distance with unnatural speed. Mom grabbed my hand and pulled me behind a large boulder, pressing us both against the stone and motioning for silence. The thing that Emma found hardest to accept, Mom whispered directly into my ear, was that she'd abandoned them. Even though there was nothing she could have done, even though staying would have meant joining them in whatever fate they'd met, she couldn't forgive herself for choosing survival over loyalty. The light passed maybe 20 feet from our hiding place, casting no beam and revealing nothing about what carried it. But in the brief moment when it was closest, I felt a presence. Something aware and malevolent that radiated hunger and patience in equal measure. When it had moved past, we emerged from behind the boulder and continued toward the road. The other lights had resumed their distant observation, maintaining their loose circle, but allowing us to progress toward the highway. Emma never married, Mom said as we walked. Never had children, never formed close relationships with anyone. She told me once that she was afraid of caring about people too much, afraid that her presence might put them in danger. We reached the base of another hill, and I could see that the road was closer now, maybe 2 more miles of rough terrain. But I could also see that the circle of lights had tightened around us again, and new ones were appearing from beyond the original perimeter. She moved to the city, got a job in an office, lived a quiet life that attracted no attention, Mom continued as we began climbing again. But she never stopped watching over her shoulder, never stopped listening for scratching sounds on her roof, never stopped wondering when they would come for her. At the top of this hill, we could see the road clearly. There was even some traffic, the red taillights of a truck disappearing into the distance, the approaching headlights of what might have been a police patrol. Safety was within reach, but the lights behind us had formed a solid wall now, and they were advancing. Not quickly, but with inexorable purpose, driving us toward the road like sheep toward a pen. Emma died 3 years ago? Mom said suddenly, the words hitting me like a physical blow. Heart attack in her sleep, the doctor said. But I always wondered if she'd finally stopped running, stopped looking over her shoulder, and they'd finally caught up with her. We half ran, half stumbled down the final slope toward the highway. The advancing lights were maybe 100 yards behind us now, close enough that I could sense the malevolent intelligence guiding them. Whatever they were, they wanted us to reach the road, wanted us to carry our terror back to the world of normal people. My feet hit asphalt just as a pair of headlights crested the hill ahead of us. Mom stepped into the road, waving her arms frantically, and the vehicle, a highway patrol car, slowed and pulled over. The officer who emerged was young, professional, concerned about two people wandering around in the desert in the middle of the night. "Car trouble?" he asked, playing his flashlight over our faces. "Engine overheated," Mom said, her voice remarkably steady given what we'd just experienced. We had to abandon it back there and walk out. I looked back toward the valley where we'd left the van. The lights were gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. In the distance, I could just make out the faint glow of our vehicle's emergency flashers, right where we'd left it. "I'll call for a tow truck," the officer said. "You can wait in the patrol car where it's safe." Safe. The word felt foreign, almost meaningless after what we'd experienced. As we climbed into the back seat of the police car, I realized that Emma's story had become our story, that we'd joined her in the ranks of people who'd seen something that shouldn't exist and would spend the rest of our lives wondering when it might come back. The tow truck arrived 30 minutes later, and we followed it back to where we'd abandoned the van. The engine started on the first try, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. The mechanic who looked under the hood found no signs of overheating, no explanation for why we'd broken down. We drove home in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Mom never finished Emma's story, never explained how her aunt had really died or what she'd been running from all those years. Some stories, I realized, don't have endings. They just pause, waiting for the next person to stumble into them. Even now, 15 years later, I find myself checking the locks on my doors at night, listening for scratching sounds on the roof, wondering if the lights in the valley are still there, waiting patiently for their next visitors. Emma's story became part of me that night, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. And sometimes when I'm driving alone on dark roads far from civilization, I catch glimpses in my rearview mirror of lights that move too smoothly across the landscape, maintaining impossible formations as they track my progress. I tell myself they're just other cars, coincidental traffic patterns, tricks of tired eyes, and an overactive imagination. But I never stop to find out for sure, because some stories are better left unfinished and some truths are too dangerous to pursue. Emma learned that lesson 30 years ago, and I learned it from her. The desert keeps its secrets, and sometimes the wisest thing you can do is keep driving and never look back. I'm not exactly sure what me and a few friends experienced fully that October weekend in 2019, but there was definitely something deeply unsettling about our encounter, something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it too long. This story takes place during the fall of 2019, when I was 17 years old. Our Boy Scout troop had planned a cabin campout at a remote location deep in the pine forests of northern Michigan, far from any main roads or cell phone towers. The moment our convoy of vehicles pulled up to the weathered log cabin, I felt an odd sensation settle in my stomach. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for months, with peeling paint on the shutters and a sagging front porch that groaned under the weight of fallen branches. The surrounding woods pressed in close on all sides, creating a claustrophobic feeling that made the clearing feel smaller than it actually was. Ancient pine trees towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the late afternoon sunlight, casting everything in an eerie twilight, even though it was only 4 o'clock. Our troop leader, Mr. Rodriguez, a gruff man in his 50s with calloused hands and permanent stubble, gathered us around as we unloaded our gear from the trailers. "Listen up, boys," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "This place is pretty isolated, so stick to the main paths and don't wander off alone. The nearest ranger station is 20 miles away, and cell service is non-existent out here." As we hauled our duffel bags and sleeping bags toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the tree line, searching for movement among the shadows. The other scouts seemed excited about our wilderness adventure, chattering loudly about the games they'd brought and the s'mores we'd make later, but their voices sounded muted and strange in the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. Inside the cabin, the musty smell of old wood and damp fabric hit us immediately. The main room featured a stone fireplace blackened with years of use, and mounted deer heads stared down at us with glassy eyes that seemed to follow our movements. My friend Camden and I claimed a small bedroom near the back of the cabin, close to one of the few electrical outlets available. The room felt cramped with its low ceiling and single grimy window that looked out into the darkening woods. As we unpacked our belongings, Camden pulled out his phone and frowned at the screen. "No signal at all," he muttered, holding it up toward the window. "Not even one bar." The isolation suddenly felt more real, more complete. We were truly cut off from the outside world, surrounded by miles of empty forest, with no way to call for help if something went wrong. The first evening passed without major incident, though I found myself constantly aware of the sounds outside our windows. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense up, and I noticed several other scouts glancing nervously toward the doors whenever the wind picked up. We played cards by lamplight and roasted hot dogs over the fireplace, but underneath the forced normalcy, there was an undercurrent of unease that none of us wanted to acknowledge out loud. The next morning brought a thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke, reducing visibility to just a few yards in any direction. When I stepped outside to use the primitive outhouse behind the cabin, the mist swirled around my legs and made the familiar landscape look alien and threatening. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzzing. Nothing but the soft whisper of my footsteps on the damp pine needles. We spent most of the morning inside the cabin, playing card games and taking turns on the GameCube that one of the younger scouts had brought along. Someone had also packed a portable projector, which we set up in the main room to play movies on a white sheet hung across one wall. The artificial entertainment helped distract us from the oppressive atmosphere outside, but every so often one of us would glance toward the windows, where the fog pressed against the glass like searching fingers. Camden and I had become close friends over the past 2 years in scouting, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and video games. He was smaller than me, with sandy hair and quick reflexes, while I had always been the biggest kid in our group, a fact that usually meant I got stuck with the heavy lifting. Today was no exception when Mr. Rodriguez announced that we were running low on drinking water. "The pump house is about a mile down the main trail," he explained, pointing through the window toward a barely visible path that disappeared into the fog. "Someone needs to take these 5-gallon jugs down there and fill them up." He gestured toward 3 large plastic containers stacked near the door. "It's not a difficult walk, but those jugs will be heavy when they're full." I volunteered immediately, partly out of a sense of duty and partly because I was getting restless cooped up inside. Camden offered to come with me, along with 2 other scouts, Ryan, a quiet kid with thick glasses, and Brandon, who was known for his nervous laugh and tendency to jump at shadows. The 4 of us loaded the empty jugs into backpacks and prepared to venture out into the fog. As we stepped off the cabin's front porch, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The fog muffled all sound, creating a bubble of silence that moved with us as we walked. Our footsteps on the pine needle path sounded unnaturally loud, and I found myself walking more quietly without consciously deciding to do so. The trail was well marked with small wooden posts, but the limited visibility made it feel like we were walking through an endless gray void. About halfway to our destination, we discovered something that would prove crucial later that night. Beside the trail, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, sat an old wooden cart with two large wheels and a long handle. It looked like something a groundskeeper might use to haul tools or supplies around the property. The wood was weathered and gray, but the cart appeared sturdy enough to handle some weight. "This could save us a lot of effort," I said, testing the handle. The cart rolled smoothly despite its age, and I realized it would be perfect for transporting the heavy water jugs back to the cabin. We made a mental note of its location and continued toward the pump house. The pump house materialized out of the fog like something from a fever dream. It was a small concrete block building with a single yellow light fixture mounted above a heavy metal door. Next to it stood a more modern structure that appeared to be a shower facility for campers, complete with exterior spigots and an electrical meter that hummed quietly in the damp air. Between the two buildings, an old-fashioned hand pump extended from a concrete pad, its metal handle worn smooth by countless hands. What struck me most about the location was how isolated it felt. We were near the edge of a small lake that we could barely make out through the fog, its dark water lapping gently against an unseen shore. The entire area felt abandoned, as if we were the first people to visit in months or even years. Rust stains streaked down the sides of the pump house, and spiderwebs stretched between the buildings, heavy with moisture from the fog. Camden approached the pump handle while Ryan and Brandon stood guard with the empty jugs. The mechanism was stiff at first, requiring both of us to work the handle up and down before water began to flow. The liquid that emerged was ice cold and had a metallic taste that suggested it came from deep underground. As we filled the first jug, the sound of rushing water seemed absurdly loud in the fog-muffled environment. "This place gives me the creeps," Brandon whispered, his voice barely audible over the pumping sounds. He kept glancing around nervously, adjusting his glasses and shifting his weight from foot to foot. "It feels like we're being watched." I had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. There was something about the pump house area that felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the way the fog seemed thicker here, or how the yellow light created harsh shadows that shifted and moved with every small breeze. Or maybe it was the absolute silence from the lake, which should have been alive with the sounds of waterfowl and insects, but instead seemed completely dead. As we filled the second jug, Ryan pointed toward the shower building. "Look at that," he said quietly. Through one of the windows, we could see what appeared to be a figure standing motionless inside. The silhouette was barely visible through the grimy glass and fog, but it was definitely human-shaped and seemed to be facing in our direction. We all froze, staring at the window. After several long seconds, Camden called out, "Hello? Is someone in there?" His voice cracked slightly with nervousness. There was no response. The figure didn't move or acknowledge us in any way. After another minute of watching, the silhouette seemed to fade away, though whether it had moved or was simply obscured by shifting fog was impossible to tell. "Probably just shadows," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "The fog is playing tricks on us." But as we filled the third and final jug, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were indeed being observed. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to duck behind the buildings or slip back into the fog whenever I turned to look directly at them. The other boys were experiencing the same thing. I could see it in their tense postures and the way they kept scanning our surroundings. By the time we finished filling the water jugs, the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing more of the lake and surrounding area. What we saw didn't make us feel any better. The lake stretched away into the distance, its surface perfectly still and black as oil. No boats were visible, no docks or other signs of human activity. On the far shore, dense forest pressed right up to the water's edge, creating an unbroken wall of dark trees. Loading the 3 full water jugs onto the cart we'd found proved to be more challenging than expected. Each jug now weighed over 40 pounds, and the cart's wooden bed was just barely large enough to accommodate all three. Camden and I worked together to secure them with some bungee cords we'd brought, while Ryan and Brandon kept watch for any signs of the mysterious figure we'd seen in the shower building. The journey back to the cabin should have been straightforward, but the fog was playing havoc with our sense of direction. The wooden trail markers seemed to appear and disappear at random, and more than once we had to backtrack when the path seemed to fork in directions we didn't remember from our trip down. The cart's wheels, which had rolled smoothly when empty, now squeaked and groaned under the weight of the water, creating a rhythmic noise that seemed to echo strangely in the muffled air. About halfway back, we encountered something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. Stretched across the trail at about chest height was a single strand of spider web, but it was unlike any web I'd ever seen. The silk was thick and almost rope-like, glistening with moisture from the fog. What made it truly disturbing was its placement. It was positioned perfectly to catch someone walking down the trail, and it was far too large and strong to have been created by any ordinary spider. "That wasn't there when we came down," Camden said quietly, his voice tight with anxiety. He was right. We definitely would have walked into it on our way to the pump house. Someone or something had placed it there while we were filling the water jugs. Brandon laughed nervously. "Maybe it's just a really big spider, like those ones you see in nature documentaries." But his attempt at humor fell flat. We all knew that no spider in Michigan could create a web like this. I used a stick to break the web and clear the path, but the incident left us all even more on edge. As we continued toward the cabin, I noticed that the boys were unconsciously bunching together, staying as close to the cart as possible. The fog seemed to be closing in around us again, reducing our visibility to just a few feet in any direction. When we finally reached the cabin, the other scouts and leaders greeted us with obvious relief. Apparently, we'd been gone much longer than anyone expected, nearly 3 hours for what should have been a simple 1-hour round trip. Mr. Rodriguez looked particularly concerned as he helped us unload the water jugs. "Everything go okay down there?" he asked, studying our faces. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost." I exchanged glances with Camden before answering. "Just took longer than we thought. The fog made navigation tricky. I didn't mention the figure in the shower building or the mysterious web across the trail. Something told me that talking about those incidents would only make them seem more real, more threatening." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. The fog finally lifted around 4 o'clock, revealing the full extent of our isolation. In every direction, unbroken forests stretched to the horizon. No roads were visible, no power lines, no signs of civilization except for the faint trail we'd followed to the pump house. The cabin suddenly felt like a tiny island of safety in a vast ocean of wilderness. As evening approached, Mr. Rodriguez made an announcement that filled me with dread. "We're going to need more water for tonight and tomorrow morning," he said, gesturing toward the 3 jugs we'd brought back. "A couple of you will need to make another run down to the pump house after dinner." My stomach dropped. The thought of returning to that isolated, fog-shrouded location was terrifying enough in daylight. The idea of going there after dark was almost unbearable. By 9 o'clock that evening, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and a light frost was beginning to form on the cabin's windows. Inside, we'd built up a roaring fire in the stone fireplace, but the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the chill that had settled deep in my bones. When Mr. Rodriguez approached Camden and me about making the water run, I felt my heart begin to race. "I know it's not ideal timing," he said apologetically, "but we really can't wait until morning. We need water for cooking breakfast and cleaning up." He handed us each a heavy-duty flashlight and pointed toward the door. "Take the cart again and stick to the main trail. You should be back within an hour." I pulled on my heaviest coat and a pair of insulated gloves, but no amount of clothing could protect me from the feeling of dread that was growing stronger by the minute. From the moment I stepped outside the cabin's warm interior, every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around and go back inside. The darkness beyond our flashlight beams was absolute. A thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow light and sound. Camden was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as we loaded the empty water jugs onto the cart. "It's just a quick trip," he said, as much to himself as to me. "Down and back, no problem." The trail that had been merely unsettling in daylight fog now felt actively malevolent in the darkness. Our flashlight beams created moving circles of visibility that only emphasized how much we couldn't see. The pine trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches creating overhead canopies that blocked out even the faint starlight. Every few steps, we'd hear sounds in the darkness, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded almost human. About 10 minutes into our journey, we reached the area where we'd found the cart earlier that day. During daylight, it had seemed like a perfectly normal section of trail. Now, in the darkness, it felt like entering a different world entirely. The trees here were older and larger, their massive trunks disappearing into the blackness above our heads. The undergrowth was thicker too, creating countless hiding places where anything could be lurking just beyond the reach of our lights. "Did you hear that?" Camden whispered suddenly, stopping so abruptly that I nearly crashed the cart into him. I listened carefully but heard only the wind moving through the pine needles overhead. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. Like someone walking parallel to the trail, keeping pace with us." His voice was barely audible, and I could see his hands shaking as he gripped his flashlight. We stood motionless for nearly a minute, straining to hear anything unusual. The forest around us was silent except for the natural sounds of wind and settling branches. But as we started walking again, I began to notice what Camden was talking about. There was a subtle rhythm in the background noise, a pattern that seemed to match our own footsteps but remained just out of sync enough to be noticeable. "It's probably just echoes," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. The sound was too deliberate, too consistent to be a simple echo. Whatever was making it was definitely keeping pace with us, staying roughly 20 or 30 feet off the trail, but matching our speed exactly. As we approached the fenced area where the canoes and kayaks were stored, the feeling of being watched intensified dramatically. The chain-link fence created geometric shadows in our flashlight beams, turning the familiar storage area into a maze of dark spaces where anything could be hiding. The boats themselves, overturned and covered with tarps, looked like sleeping animals in the darkness. "I can't do this," I said suddenly, stopping the cart and turning to face Camden. "Something is seriously wrong out here. We need to go back and get more people, or wait until morning." Camden's face was pale in the flashlight beam, but he shook his head stubbornly. "We're already halfway there. It would take just as long to go back as to keep going forward." He was right, mathematically speaking, but every fiber of my being was telling me to retreat. The sensation of being stalked had grown so strong that I felt like prey being herded toward a trap. But Camden was already walking ahead, and I couldn't abandon him to face whatever was out there alone. The pump house area looked entirely different in the darkness. The single yellow light above the door cast harsh shadows that seemed to move and shift with every small breeze, creating a constantly changing landscape of bright spots and impenetrable black pools. The lake beyond was invisible except for the occasional glint of reflected light on its surface, making it feel like we were standing at the edge of an abyss. As we approached the pump, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The area around the buildings, which had been empty during our afternoon visit, was now littered with what looked like debris. Pieces of cloth, scattered papers, and dark stains on the concrete that definitely hadn't been there before. Camden saw it too, and we both stopped about 20 feet away from the pump. "Maybe someone else was here," he suggested, but his voice was uncertain. "Another camping group or something." I swept my flashlight beam across the scattered materials, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The cloth pieces looked like they might have been clothing at one point, but they were now just torn rags covered in mud, and what might have been dried blood. The papers were too damaged to read, but they appeared to be pages torn from books or magazines. "We should go back," I said firmly. "Right now. Something happened here." But before Camden could respond, we heard a sound that made both of us freeze in terror. From somewhere inside the shower building came a low, rhythmic thumping noise, like someone pounding on a wall or door. The sound was muffled but persistent, and it seemed to be coming from multiple locations within the building simultaneously. Camden grabbed my arm. "There's someone trapped in there," he whispered urgently. "We have to help them." Every rational part of my mind was screaming that this was exactly the wrong thing to do, but the possibility that someone was in distress overrode my survival instincts. We approached the shower building cautiously, our flashlights trained on the dark windows. The thumping sounds continued, sometimes from the left side of the building, sometimes from the right, as if whatever was making them was moving around inside. "Hello?" Camden called out, his voice echoing strangely in the night air. "Is someone in there? Do you need help?" The thumping stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. We waited for several long minutes, but there was no response, no indication that anyone had heard us. "Maybe it was just pipes," I suggested weakly. "Old building, water pressure issues." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The sounds had been too deliberate, too purposeful. And now, as we stood in the harsh yellow light, I was becoming aware of another disturbing detail. The ground around the shower building was covered with footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all leading to and from the building in a chaotic pattern that suggested frantic activity. Some of the prints were clearly human, but others were harder to identify. They were roughly the same size as human footprints, but seemed to have an odd shape, as if the person making them had been wearing unusual shoes or had some kind of physical deformity. "We need to fill the water and get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Right now." Camden nodded, and we hurried to the pump. The mechanism worked exactly as it had during our afternoon visit, but every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The squeak of the handle, the rush of water into the jugs, even our own breathing seemed absurdly loud. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was approaching from the darkness behind us. As we filled the second jug, the thumping sounds from the shower building resumed. This time, they were accompanied by what sounded like scratching or scraping, as if someone was dragging fingernails across metal or concrete. The noises were definitely coming from inside the building, but they seemed to be moving around in ways that defied logic, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from what sounded like underground. "Hurry up," Camden urged, his voice tight with panic. "Whatever's in there, I don't want to meet it." We were loading the third and final jug onto the cart when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something large and dark had emerged from behind the pump house and was moving toward us with deliberate, measured steps. I spun around, training my flashlight beam in that direction, but the light revealed only empty ground and the dark tree line beyond. "Did you see that?" I asked Camden, but he was already pushing the cart toward the trail, eager to get away from the pump house area. "I saw something," he replied grimly. "Let's talk about it when we're back at the cabin." The return journey began badly and only got worse. The cart, now loaded with over 120 pounds of water, was much harder to maneuver on the uneven trail. The wheels caught on roots and rocks, and several times we nearly lost control entirely as we navigated around curves in the darkness. Our flashlight beams, which had seemed adequate on the way down, now felt pathetically weak against the surrounding blackness. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Camden suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen," he whispered urgently. I stopped pushing the cart and strained my ears. At first I heard only the normal sounds of the forest: wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of settling branches. But then I caught it: the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the trail behind us. Not the subtle, off-rhythm sounds we'd heard earlier, but clear, deliberate footsteps that were definitely following us and getting closer. We both turned around, shining our flashlights back down the trail. The beams revealed nothing but empty paths stretching away into the darkness, but the footstep sounds continued. Whatever was making them was staying just beyond the reach of our lights, matching our pace and maintaining a consistent distance. "Maybe it's another camper," Camden suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Someone else who needed water." I didn't bother responding. Every instinct I possessed was telling me that whatever was following us was not another camper. The footsteps had an odd quality to them, as if the person making them was having trouble maintaining a normal walking rhythm. Sometimes they came in quick bursts, sometimes they dragged slightly, and occasionally they seemed to pause for several seconds before resuming. We picked up our pace, pushing the cart as fast as we dared on the rough trail. The footsteps behind us immediately matched our increased speed. When we slowed down to navigate around a fallen branch, the sound slowed down too. Whatever was back there was definitely tracking us. As we approached the fenced area with the canoes and kayaks, the feeling of impending danger became almost overwhelming. This was the same spot where I'd felt most uneasy during our afternoon trip, and now in the darkness, it felt like walking into an ambush. The chain-link fence created a maze of shadows, and the overturned boats provided countless hiding places for anything that might be waiting for us. "We need to move fast through this section," I told Camden. "Don't stop for anything." He nodded, and we pushed the cart forward at a near-jogging pace. The water jugs bounced and sloshed with our increased speed, and I was terrified that one of them would fall off and we'd have to stop to retrieve it. The footsteps behind us were getting closer now, no longer making any attempt at stealth. I could hear them clearly over the sound of the cartwheels and our own labored breathing. We were about halfway through the fenced area when Camden suddenly screamed, "What the hell is that?" I spun around to look where he was pointing, and my blood froze in my veins. Standing at the far end of the fenced area, clearly visible in our combined flashlight beams, was a figure that looked human, but moved in ways that were definitely not human. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to flutter and shift even though there was no wind. But what made it truly terrifying was the way it moved, not walking or running, but flowing across the ground like smoke, covering distance with impossible speed. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning any pretense of staying calm. We both broke into a sprint, leaving the cart behind in our panic. Camden, being smaller and faster, immediately pulled ahead of me, but I kept pace as best I could despite my injured knee and the 30-pound backpack I was still wearing. Behind us, I could hear the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, moving much faster than any human could run. The trail that had seemed endless during our careful walk down now flashed by in a blur of pine trees and shadows. My lungs burned from the cold air and exertion, and my injured knee was sending shooting pains up my leg with every step. But I didn't dare slow down. Whatever was chasing us was gaining ground, and I could hear it breathing, deep, ragged gasps that sounded more animal than human. Camden was shouting something ahead of me, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my own pounding heartbeat and the crashing noises behind us. All I could think about was reaching the cabin, getting inside, and barricading the door against whatever was out there in the darkness. We burst through the cabin door like our lives depended on it, which they very well might have. Camden immediately slammed the door behind us and threw the deadbolt, while I collapsed onto the nearest chair, gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably. The warm interior of the cabin felt like a sanctuary after the nightmare we'd just experienced, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly safe yet. Mr. Rodriguez and several other scouts immediately surrounded us, demanding to know what had happened and where we'd left the water. Between gasping breaths, I managed to explain that we'd had to abandon the cart and run, though I left out most of the details about what we'd seen. Camden was in even worse shape than me, shaking so badly he could barely speak. "Something was chasing us," he finally managed to say. It wasn't human. It moved like nothing I've ever seen before. Mr. Rodriguez looked skeptical but concerned. Are you sure it wasn't just a bear or a deer that spooked you? The mind can play tricks on you in the dark woods. I wanted to tell him about the figure we'd seen, about the way it had moved across the ground without seeming to touch it, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Instead, I just nodded and let him think we'd been frightened by a wild animal. After we'd warmed up and calmed down somewhat, Camden pulled me aside and described what he'd seen that made him scream. When we got to the fence area, he said quietly, I saw someone in my peripheral vision. A man, but not normal. He was running toward us at full speed, but he was running wrong, like his legs were too long, or his joints bent the wrong way. And when I blinked and looked directly at him, he just vanished. I believed him completely. I'd heard the running footsteps and had seen something myself, a dark silhouette that seemed to flicker in and out of existence at the edge of my vision. Whatever had been stalking us through the forest was not a bear or a deer or any other normal woodland creature. None of us got much rest that night. Every small sound outside the cabin, the wind in the trees, settling branches, the distant call of an owl, made us all tense up and stare toward the windows. I kept my flashlight next to my sleeping bag and jumped at every shadow that moved across the moonlit walls. When dawn finally arrived, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold, Mr. Rodriguez organized a search party to retrieve the abandoned water cart. I volunteered to go along, partly out of curiosity and partly because I needed to see the area in daylight to convince myself that what we'd experienced was real. The walk back to the fenced area in broad daylight was surreal. The trail that had seemed so threatening in the darkness now looked perfectly normal, just a dirt path winding through pine trees. But when we reached the spot where we'd abandoned the cart, we found evidence that our terror had been justified. The cart was exactly where we'd left it, with all 3 water jugs still secure in the wooden bed. But the ground around it told a disturbing story. The soft earth was covered with footprints, dozens of them, all apparently made by the same person. The prints circled the cart multiple times, as if someone had been examining it carefully from every angle. But these weren't normal footprints. They were elongated and narrow, at least twice as long as any human foot should be. The impressions were deep too, suggesting that whatever made them was either very heavy or moving with tremendous force. Most disturbing of all, some of the prints showed what appeared to be claw marks at the toe end. Camden and I exchanged glances but said nothing. Mr. Rodriguez and the other adults examined the prints with obvious puzzlement, but no one offered any explanations. We loaded the cart and headed back to the cabin in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd discovered. As we packed up our gear later that morning, preparing for the drive home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief to be leaving. The cabin that had seemed like an adventure just 2 days earlier now felt like a trap, and the surrounding forest seemed to press in on us with malevolent intent. But as our convoy of vehicles pulled away from the clearing and began the long drive back to civilization, I caught one final glimpse of something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. In my side mirror, I saw a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line watching us leave. It was too far away to make out any details, but something about its posture and the way it held itself made it clear that it wasn't human. Camden saw it too. He gripped my arm and pointed back toward the cabin, but when we both turned around to look directly, the figure was gone. Only empty forest remained, peaceful and normal in the morning sunlight. To this day, I'm not sure what we encountered in those woods. Was it some kind of hermit living wild in the forest? A person with severe mental illness who had been stalking campers? Or was it something else entirely? Something that science hasn't cataloged and probably wouldn't believe. I've never been able to find the exact location of that cabin again. Mr. Rodriguez left our scout troop a few months later, and the rental records seemed to have disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if the whole experience was some kind of shared delusion. a mass hysteria brought on by isolation and darkness. But then I remember the footprints we found the next morning, and the look of absolute terror on Camden's face when he saw that figure running toward us. Whatever was stalking us through those dark woods was real, and it's still out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows for the next group of unsuspecting campers to venture too far from safety. I pray to God that I never have to find out what it really was. For 15 years, I've lived my life behind the wheel of a Peterbilt, watching America scroll by through my windshield like an endless documentary on the changing landscape of this vast country. The rhythmic hum of 18 wheels on asphalt has been my lullaby, and truck stop coffee my lifeblood. The names Hank Mercer and long-haul trucking isn't just my profession, it's my calling. Most people don't understand the solitude of the open road, the strange brotherhood that exists among those of us who spend more time in our cabs than in our homes. We're modern-day nomads, delivering the lifeblood of commerce across state lines while the rest of the world sleeps. It's not glamorous, but there's a freedom to it that gets in your blood and never leaves. That Wednesday, in late October, started like any other. I was at the Flying J outside of Butte, Montana, loading up on caffeine before heading east with a trailer full of industrial equipment bound for Minneapolis. The morning air had that sharp bite that signals winter's approach in the northern states, crisp enough to make your lungs ache if you breathed too deeply. "Gonna be a cold one tonight, Hank," said Doris, the night shift waitress who'd been serving me eggs and hash browns for the better part of a decade. She topped off my coffee with practiced precision. "They're saying snow in the passes by tomorrow." "Appreciate the heads up," I replied, leaving her a generous tip before heading back to my rig. "I'll try to beat it through to Billings before it hits." My truck was a 2019 Peterbilt 389, midnight blue with chrome accents that caught the early morning sun like liquid silver. Not the newest model, but maintained with religious devotion. In this business, your rig is your livelihood, your home, and sometimes your only companion. I settled into the worn leather seat, adjusted my mirrors, and began my pre-drive check, a ritual as familiar as brushing my teeth. The diesel engine rumbled to life, a comforting growl that vibrated through the cabin. The dispatcher had already sent my route details to my phone, but something about technology still felt intrusive in the sanctuary of my cab. I preferred paper maps and instinct, old school, Randy called it. Randy Wilcox had been my road buddy for nearly 7 years, ever since we got stranded at the same truck stop during an ice storm in Wyoming. He was hauling produce west while I was headed east with electronics. We ended up playing cards for 12 hours straight, swapping stories about life on the road, and formed a friendship that stuck. We tried to sync our routes when possible, kept in touch by CB, and always had each other's backs. "Breaker 19, this is Blue Thunder. Randy, you got your ears on?" I spoke into the CB radio, using the handle I'd had since my first solo run. Static crackled before Randy's voice came through. "Morning, Hank. I'm about 50 miles east of you on I-90. Clear sailing so far." "Good to hear. I'm rolling out now. Should catch up to you by lunchtime." "Roger that. Smoky report is all clear. See you at the usual spot." The usual spot was a small roadside diner just outside of Livingston. Family-owned, great food, and off the beaten path enough that it wasn't overrun with tourists. Randy and I tried to meet there whenever our routes aligned. As I pulled onto the interstate, the rising sun painted the Montana mountains in shades of purple and gold. Moments like these were why I could never give up the road. The solitary witness to America waking up, the ever-changing tableau of natural beauty that most people only see in photographs. The first few hours passed without incident. Traffic was light, the weather held, and the satellite radio kept me company with a mixture of classic rock and true crime podcasts. I'd always had a fascination with the darker side of human nature. Something about the isolation of the highway made you think about vulnerability and the thin line between safety and danger. It was nearly noon when my GPS alerted me to a traffic delay ahead. An accident had closed 2 lanes about 20 miles up, causing a backup that would add at least an hour to my drive time. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Hank, you seeing that mess on I-90? "Just got the alert," I confirmed, looking at a significant delay. "There's a detour you can take. Old service road that runs parallel for about 30 miles. Might save you some time. I'm sending the directions to your phone now." I frowned. Detours weren't uncommon, but I preferred sticking to main routes, especially in mountain country where service roads could quickly become treacherous. Still, time was money in this business, and the client in Minneapolis was expecting their delivery by Friday morning. "Copy that. I'll check it out." The directions led me to an exit I'd passed dozens of times but never taken. A narrow off-ramp that disappeared into dense pine forest. A weathered sign indicated it was Forest Service Road 217, but the paint was so faded it was barely legible. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated, then reached for my phone to call Randy. "Hey, dispatch is routing me on some Forest Service road to bypass an accident. You ever take 217 near Belgrade?" Randy's voice came through, breaking up slightly. "Can't say I have. Sounds sketchy. Might be better to delay." His voice dissolved into static, then silence. Cell reception was spotty in these mountains at the best of times. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, considering my options. The traffic report now showed the backup extending for miles with no estimated clearance time. The detour would save me hours if it worked out. "Ah, hell," I muttered, and turned onto the exit. Little did I know that this simple decision, one made by truckers every day, would change my life forever. That it would lead me down a twisted path into darkness. That by nightfall I would be fighting for my life in a remote clearing, bleeding from a shotgun wound, with no one but the stars to witness my struggle. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I had to make my way down that lonely forest road, where the shadows seemed to deepen with every mile, and the strange sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Forest Service Road 217 started innocently enough, a 2-lane paved road winding through towering pines. My GPS showed it running roughly parallel to the interstate for about 30 miles before reconnecting near Bozeman. The dispatcher had said it would save me time, but something felt off from the moment my tires hit the pavement. The road was eerily empty. No other vehicles, no signs of maintenance, just an endless corridor of trees pressing in from both sides. The pavement gradually deteriorated, cracked asphalt giving way to patches of gravel, then back to pavement so weathered it looked ancient. My rig bounced and swayed, the load shifting slightly behind me. "Should have stuck to the damn interstate," I muttered, slowing to a crawl over a particularly rough section. 2 hours in, and I was beginning to think I'd made a serious miscalculation. The GPS signal kept cutting out, leaving me with nothing but my own sense of direction and the vague notion that I was still heading east. The forest had thickened to the point where midday sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting the road in a perpetual twilight. I tried the CB again. "Breaker 19, this is Blue Thunder. Anybody copy?" Nothing but static answered me. My phone showed no service. The radio stations had dissolved into white noise miles back, and the only sound was the labored breathing of my engine as it navigated the increasingly challenging terrain. I was completely alone. It was around 3 p.m. when I spotted the first sign of human presence, a rusted mailbox tilting drunkenly at the mouth of a narrow dirt driveway. No name, no address, just a silent sentinel at the edge of the forest. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of something down that driveway. What might have been a cabin, or perhaps just a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. The road grew narrower, forcing me to slow to a crawl. My 18-wheeler was never meant for routes like this, and I cursed myself for not trusting my initial instincts. The dispatcher had clearly never driven this road herself. or she'd never have suggested it for a rig my size. Another hour passed. The GPS flickered back to life momentarily, showing me miles from where I thought I was. Deeper into the national forest, on a road that didn't seem to have any connection to the interstate at all. Then it died again, the screen going black as if to emphasize my isolation. As daylight began to fade, panic crept in around the edges of my thoughts. I was low on fuel, with no idea how far it was to the next town. Turning around on this narrow road would be nearly impossible with my trailer. The only option was to press forward and hope the road eventually led somewhere. That's when I spotted the clearing. It opened up suddenly on my right, a wide, flat area just off the road that looked like it might have been used for logging operations once upon a time. Large enough to park my rig and reassess the situation. Maybe even attempt a three-point turn if necessary. I pulled off the road, the tires crunching on gravel and pine needles. The engine sighed with relief as I cut the ignition. The sudden silence was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like a physical force. No birds, no insects, no distant traffic noise, just the occasional ping of cooling metal from my engine. Stepping down from the cab, I stretched my cramped muscles and took stock of my surroundings. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 100 yards across, bordered on all sides by dense forest. The trees seemed to lean inward, as if studying this human intruder in their domain. The air smelled of pine resin and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. My watch showed 5:17 p.m. Daylight was already fading, and with it, any realistic hope of finding my way back to civilization before dark. I reached for my phone again. Still no service. The CB radio in my truck remained stubbornly silent. I was deciding whether to spend the night in my cab or risk driving further in the dark when I heard it. The distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. Relief washed over me. Another soul on this godforsaken road meant potential help, or at least information about where the hell I was. The sound grew louder, and I moved to the edge of the clearing to flag down the approaching driver. The vehicle rounded the bend. An old Ford pickup truck, once white, but now a patchwork of rust and primer. It slowed as it approached the clearing, then turned in, headlights sweeping across me like searchlights. The truck stopped about 30 yards away, engine idling roughly. The headlights remained on, blinding me and preventing me from seeing the driver clearly. A moment passed, then another. Nobody emerged from the cab. "Hello?" I called out, raising a hand to shield my eyes from the glare. "You from around here? I could use some directions." The driver's door creaked open, and a figure stepped out, tall and lean, silhouetted against the headlights. Something about the deliberate way he moved sent a chill down my spine. He stood there for a long moment, just watching me. "Road's not meant for big rigs," he finally said, his voice a gravelly rasp that barely carried across the clearing. "You're lost." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yeah, trying to bypass an accident on I-90. GPS routed me this way." He laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Ain't no way back to the interstate from here. Not for something that size." He began walking toward me, his movements stiff but purposeful. As he got closer, details emerged from the shadows. Faded flannel shirt, work-worn jeans, beard streaked with gray. His face remained in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, assessing. "Where does this road lead, then?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the growing unease in my gut. "Nowhere you want to go." He stopped about 10 feet away, just close enough for me to make out his features in the fading light. Deep-set eyes, hollow cheeks, skin weathered by decades of mountain sun and wind. But it was his expression that froze my blood. Utterly emotionless, eyes flat and cold as river stones. I noticed then what he carried. A shotgun, held casually at his side as if it were simply an extension of his arm. That's quite a greeting, I said, nodding toward the weapon. Bears in these woods, he replied tonelessly. Never know what you might run into. My eyes darted back to my truck, calculating the distance. My own firearm was locked in the glove compartment. Might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me now. Look, I said, forcing a smile. I'm just trying to get back to the main road. If you could point me in the right direction, I'll be on my way. What's your hurry? He asked, taking another step forward. Night's coming on. Dangerous to drive these roads in the dark. Every instinct I had was screaming danger. 15 years on the road, I'd encountered all types. Helpful locals, suspicious rednecks, tweakers looking for easy targets. This man was something else entirely. There was no emotion behind his eyes, no humanity I could appeal to. I appreciate the concern, I said, beginning to edge back toward my truck. But I really need to... Empty your pockets. He cut in, raising the shotgun slightly. Nice and slow. The game was up. This wasn't about directions or mountain hospitality. This was a robbery, plain and simple. Or something worse. Take it easy, I said, my hands rising instinctively. I don't want any trouble. Pockets, now. The shotgun was pointed at my chest, his finger hovering near the trigger. Slowly, I reached into my jacket, pulling out my wallet. Look, there's about $200 in cash. Take it and let me be on my way. All of it, he insisted. Phone too. I complied, removing my phone and a couple packs of cigarettes I kept for the long hauls. He stepped forward, snatching the items from my outstretched hand and pocketing the wallet and phone. The cigarettes he examined briefly before tucking them away as well. What do you want? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. He didn't answer, just raised the shotgun and took aim. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, but the clearing was empty save for some rocks and sticks. In that moment, staring down the barrel of that shotgun, I realized with perfect clarity that I was going to die here in this nameless clearing, miles from anywhere, at the hands of a stranger whose motivation I couldn't begin to understand. All the miles I'd driven, all the sunrises I'd witnessed from my cab, all the plans I had, none of it mattered now. The man's finger tightened on the trigger, and I braced myself for the end. Before I could react, he fired. The blast was deafening, echoing through the clearing like a crack of thunder. Pain exploded in my side as I crumpled to the ground, the world tilting sideways around me. I hadn't even had time to turn away. The shotgun pellets had torn through my left side, just below the ribs. I expected a second shot to finish the job, but it never came. Instead, I heard him laughing. A cold, emotionless sound that was somehow worse than the shotgun blast. He walked back to his truck, boots crunching on the gravel, the sound seeming absurdly loud in my shock-heightened senses. Thanks for the smokes, he called back, his voice casual, as if we just concluded a pleasant business transaction. The Ford's engine roared to life, tires spinning in the dirt as he pulled away. The sound faded gradually until I was left in silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the soft patter of my blood soaking into the earth. I tried to assess the damage, hands fumbling at my side, coming away sticky and dark. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a searing, white-hot agony that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. I could feel wetness spreading across my shirt, warm at first, then cooling rapidly in the mountain air. Help, I tried to call out, but it emerged as little more than a whisper. There was no one to hear me anyway, just miles of indifferent forest in every direction. I needed to get to my truck, to the first aid kit, to the radio. 10 yards might as well have been 10 miles in my condition, but I began to drag myself across the ground, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through my body. The dirt beneath me turned dark with blood, leaving a macabre trail behind me. Night was falling rapidly now, the clearing dimming to murky twilight. The temperature dropped with the sun, and I began to shiver, from cold or shock, I couldn't tell which. Probably both. My thoughts became increasingly disjointed as blood loss took its toll. I thought about Randy, wondering if he was looking for me yet. About my sister in Oregon, who I hadn't spoken to in months because of some stupid argument I couldn't even remember. About my dog, Rusty, staying with a neighbor while I was on this run. Who would take care of him if I didn't make it back? Time lost all meaning as I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. The stars appeared, impossibly bright against the black sky, reminding me of all the nights I'd parked in remote places, just to gaze up at them from my sleeping cab. The mountain air smelled of pine and my own blood, a coppery tang that seemed to grow stronger as the night wore on. At some point I became aware of eyes watching me from the tree line, pinpoints of reflected starlight that blinked and shifted position. Coyotes, maybe, or wolves, drawn by the scent of blood. They kept their distance for now, but they were patient. They could afford to wait. Not yet, I whispered to them, to myself, to whatever might be listening. Not like this. I don't know how long I lay there, bleeding and helpless. Time lost all meaning. I drifted in and out of consciousness, each return to awareness bringing fresh waves of pain and the realization that I was still alive, still fighting. During one of my lucid moments, I noticed a strange luminescence in the forest, pale blue lights that seemed to dance between the trees. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but they remained, moving closer to the clearing with each passing moment. Help! I tried again, my voice a rasping whisper. The lights paused, hovering at the edge of the clearing. There seemed to be a pattern to their movement, almost deliberate, as if they were communicating with each other. I'd heard stories from other truckers about strange phenomena in remote mountain areas. Lights that lured travelers off roads, entities that were neither human nor animal. Please, I managed, reaching a bloody hand toward them. The lights retreated slightly, then advanced again. I could almost make out shapes behind them. Tall, slender silhouettes that moved with unnatural grace. My rational mind insisted they were hallucinations brought on by blood loss and trauma, but some deeper, more primitive part of me recognized them as something else entirely. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, perhaps 20 yards from where I lay, headlights appeared on the forest road. Real, solid, unmistakably human headlights cutting through the darkness. The blue lights vanished instantly, retreating into the forest as if they'd never been. A truck pulled into the clearing, its headlights illuminating my prone form. The driver's door flew open, and a familiar figure emerged. Jesus, Hank, what the hell happened? Randy's voice, rough with panic, was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Guy, Ford, shotgun, I managed to gasp out, each word a monumental effort. Randy was at my side in an instant, his face pale with shock as he took in my condition. Holy shit, you're bleeding bad. Hold on, buddy. Just hold on. He ran back to his truck, returning with a first aid kit and his satellite phone. His hands moved with surprising gentleness for such a big man, applying pressure bandages to my wound, covering me with his jacket to ward off shock. This is gonna hurt, he warned, before pouring something that burned like liquid fire over the wound. I must have screamed, because the next thing I remember is his hand clamping over my mouth. Shh. We don't know if he's still out here. Randy called for help, his voice terse as he gave our coordinates from his GPS unit. Yes, gunshot wound. No, I don't know who. He's losing a lot of blood. Please hurry. He stayed with me, talking constantly to keep me conscious, alternating between reassurances and questions about what had happened. I told him everything I could remember. The detour, the clearing, the man with the shotgun. Did you see his face? Would you recognize him? Randy asked, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting the shooter to return. Yes, I whispered. I'll never forget it. Within an hour, the whump-whump of helicopter blades cut through the night. A search and rescue team had been dispatched from Bozeman, alerted by Randy's call. Bright lights illuminated the clearing as they landed, transforming the nightmarish scene into something clinical and urgent. Paramedics swarmed around me, their voices a blur of medical terminology. IVs were inserted, monitors attached, my wound examined and temporarily treated. They loaded me onto a stretcher, Randy's face the last thing I saw before they closed the helicopter doors. "I'll meet you at the hospital," he called. "Don't you dare die on me, Hank." As the helicopter lifted off, I caught one last glimpse of the clearing below. The dark stain of my blood on the ground, Randy's truck parked beside my abandoned rig, and just for a moment, what looked like pale blue lights at the forest edge, watching us depart. Then the darkness took me completely, and I knew nothing more. I woke to the steady beep of a cardiac monitor and the antiseptic smell of hospital linens. The ceiling above me was acoustic tile, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lighting that made my eyes water. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then the pain in my side brought it all crashing back. A nurse noticed I was awake and approached, checking the monitors before addressing me. "Welcome back, Mr. Mercer. You're at Bozeman Deaconess Hospital. Do you remember what happened to you?" "Shot," I managed, my throat raw from intubation. "In the woods." She nodded, adjusting something on my IV. "The doctor will be in shortly. You're very lucky to be alive." Lucky wasn't exactly how I felt, but I understood her meaning. The shotgun blast had torn through muscle and tissue but somehow missed vital organs. 6 inches higher or to the right, and I'd have been dead before Randy found me. The doctor arrived, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with short gray hair and glasses perched on her nose. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Dr. Patel. You've been through quite an ordeal." She explained the extent of my injuries: multiple pellet wounds to the left side, significant blood loss, early-stage hypothermia, and shock. I'd been in surgery for 4 hours while they removed shotgun pellets and repaired damaged tissue. "You'll have some impressive scars," she concluded, "but with physical therapy and time, we expect a full recovery. The police are waiting to speak with you if you feel up to it." I nodded, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Send them in." 2 officers entered, a weathered state trooper named Dawson and a younger sheriff's deputy called Martinez. They pulled up chairs beside my bed, notebooks ready. "Mr. Mercer," Trooper Dawson began, "we need to get your statement about what happened out there." I told them everything I could remember: the detour, the clearing, the man with the shotgun. I described him in detail: mid-50s to early 60s, about 6 feet tall, lean but strong, gray-streaked beard, hollow cheeks, dead eyes. The Ford pickup, white once but now rusted and primer-patched. The casual way he'd shot me, as if he were putting down a wounded animal rather than murdering a human being. "He took my wallet and phone," I added, "but that wasn't why he did it. He was going to shoot me regardless." Martinez took detailed notes while Dawson asked clarifying questions. They showed me a series of mugshots, but none of them matched the man I'd seen. "Forest Service Road 217 has been a problem area," Dawson admitted. "There have been reports of missing hikers, vandalized vehicles. Nothing like this, though." "Any other victims?" I asked. The officers exchanged glances. "Nothing confirmed," Martinez said carefully. "But there are unsolved missing persons cases in the area. People who disappeared while traveling alone. They promised to increase patrols, to check the area thoroughly, to put out an APB on the truck and driver. But I could tell from their expressions that they didn't hold out much hope of finding him. The mountains were vast, the population sparse, and a man who knew the back roads could disappear like smoke. After they left, exhaustion claimed me again, and I drifted into uneasy sleep filled with dreams of blue lights among the trees and a faceless figure raising a shotgun. The next time I woke, Randy was sitting beside my bed, his massive frame looking incongruous in the small hospital chair. His normally jovial face was creased with worry, but he managed to smile when he saw I was awake. "You look like hammered shit," he greeted me, reaching over to gently squeeze my shoulder. "Feel worse," I croaked. "Thanks for finding me." "Damn lucky I did," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When you didn't show at our meetup spot, I tried your cell. Nothing. Called dispatch, and they said you'd taken some forest road detour. Didn't sound right. You always stick to the main routes. So I backtracked, found where you'd turned off, and followed. I owed him my life, and we both knew it. In our line of work, we learn early on who we can count on. Randy had always been that person for me." "The police find anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "They're looking, but..." He trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. We both understood the odds. Randy stayed most of the day, leaving only to retrieve some clothes and personal items from my truck, which had been towed to a secure lot. He brought news from the outside world. My cargo had been transferred to another driver. My company was handling the insurance. My sister had been notified and was flying in the next day. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of pain medication, physical therapy sessions, and police interviews. They never found the man with the shotgun or my stolen wallet. My phone turned up in a ditch 20 miles from the clearing, smashed beyond repair. My sister arrived, bringing with her a wave of both comfort and tension. Catherine and I had always been close in our way, but we were as different as siblings could be. She the settled academic with a husband and 2 kids in Portland, me the nomadic trucker with no fixed address. Still, blood called to blood, and she stayed for a week, helping with my recovery and trying, in her way, to understand the life that had led me to that clearing. "You could come stay with us while you recover," she offered on her last day. "The guest room is yours as long as you need it." It was tempting. The thought of returning to the road filled me with a dread I'd never experienced before. But I knew myself well enough to recognize that hiding wouldn't heal what was broken inside me. "Thanks, Kat," I said, squeezing her hand. "But I need to get back on my own 2 feet. My own way." She looked disappointed, but not surprised. "Just promise me you'll be more careful. No more detours." "No more detours," I agreed. I stayed in the hospital for a week, recovering from the gunshot wound. Randy visited every day, bringing me news from the road and keeping my spirits up. My fellow truckers rallied around me in their way, sending messages, arranging for my dog to be cared for, even starting a collection to help with expenses not covered by insurance. The police investigation stalled. They found evidence that someone had been living in an abandoned hunting cabin near the clearing. Empty food cans, cigarette butts, a makeshift bed. But whoever it was had cleared out, leaving no fingerprints or DNA. They did find 3 sets of bones. Deer, they said. Though something about the way the trooper avoided my eyes when he told me made me wonder. Nightmares plagued me. The man with the shotgun, the blue lights in the forest, the feeling of my blood soaking into the earth. I'd wake gasping, the hospital room momentarily transformed into that clearing, the medical equipment becoming twisted trees closing in around me. The hospital psychiatrist diagnosed PTSD and prescribed medication, which I accepted but rarely took. The pills dulled everything, not just the fear, and I needed my edge if I was going to recover. When I finally got out, I took some time off to heal and think about what had happened. My company was understanding, putting me on medical leave with partial pay while I recovered. I rented a small apartment in Bozeman, unwilling to stray too far from the place where it had happened. I needed to face this thing, whatever it was, on its own ground. Physical therapy was grueling but effective. By the 3rd month, I could move without constant pain, though weather changes sent twinges through my scarred side. The deeper wounds, the ones no one could see, were slower to heal. I found myself jumping at sudden noises, scanning parking lots for white Ford pickups, sleeping with a loaded gun beside my bed. I avoided forests and isolated areas, preferring the anonymity of crowded streets and well-lit stores. Night terrors continued, though less frequently as time passed. But the strangest aftermath was my obsession with the blue lights I'd seen in the forest. In my more rational moments, I dismissed them as hallucinations brought on by blood loss and trauma. But late at night, when sleep eluded me, I found myself researching similar phenomena reported in mountain regions across the country. I discovered accounts from hikers, hunters, and other truckers who described seeing similar lights in remote areas. Dancing blue orbs that seemed to move with purpose, sometimes leading travelers deeper into wilderness, sometimes watching from a distance. Native American legends spoke of spirit lights that appeared to those close to death. Scientists dismissed them as swamp gas or electrical phenomena. Whatever they were, I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been coming for me before Randy arrived, and I wasn't sure if their intentions had been to help or to claim. 4 months after the shooting, the police called with news. They'd found my wallet in a pawn shop 200 miles away in Idaho. The man who'd pawned it matched the description I'd given, but he'd used a fake ID and disappeared before they could apprehend him. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what I already knew. He was still out there somewhere. As my body healed, I began to contemplate returning to the road. Not out of desire, but necessity. Trucking was the only life I knew, and my savings wouldn't last forever. The question wasn't if I would drive again, but how I would face the fear that now lived permanently in my gut. 6 months to the day after I was shot, I climbed back into the cab of my Peterbilt. The company had kept it for me, understanding the bond between a driver and his rig. It had been detailed and serviced, the seat adjusted to accommodate my still tender side, a new satellite radio installed as a welcome-back gift. My first run would be simple, a straight shot from Bozeman to Billings on I-90, hauling agricultural equipment. No detours, no forest roads, no isolated stops. Randy had arranged to make the same run, riding tandem with me the whole way. "Just like riding a bike," he said over the CB as we pulled out of the depot. "Except the bike weighs 40 tons and could flatten a Volkswagen." I managed to laugh, but my hands were slick with sweat on the wheel. Every curve in the road, every passing pickup truck sent my heart rate spiking. By the time we reached Livingston, my shirt was soaked through and my jaw ached from clenching. We stopped at our usual diner, though it took Randy some convincing to get me inside. I kept my back to the wall, eyes constantly moving to the door, barely tasting the food I mechanically consumed. "It gets easier," Randy said quietly. My first run after Iraq was the same. Thought every piece of trash on the road was an IED. I hadn't known he'd served. In all our years of friendship, he'd never mentioned it. That was the way with road friendships. Sometimes you knew a man's deepest fears before you knew his history. "How'd you get past it?" I asked. He considered the question, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Never really did completely, just learned to live alongside it. The fear becomes like a passenger, always there, but you decide if it gets to drive." Simple wisdom, but it helped. By the time we reached Billings, I'd settled into a rhythm. Not comfortable yet, but functional. We delivered our loads, spent the night at a modem near the depot, and headed back the next day. Over the following weeks, I gradually increased my range and complexity of runs. Bozeman to Missoula, Missoula to Spokane. Eventually, a long haul to Minneapolis, the run I'd been on when everything went sideways. I still kept to the main roads, avoided driving after dark when possible, and carried a licensed firearm in my cab. I'd given up cigarettes, couldn't stand the smell of them anymore, the association too strong with the man who'd shot me. I still had nightmares, but they were less frequent, less vivid. What I couldn't shake was the feeling of being watched. Sometimes on empty stretches of highway, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my mirrors, never anything concrete, just impressions of something pacing my truck. At night in rest stops, I'd wake to what sounded like footsteps circling my rig, though security cameras never showed anyone. And then there were the lights. I'd spot them occasionally, blue luminescence hovering at the tree line along remote stretches of road. never close enough to make out details, always gone when I looked directly at them. I told myself they were reflections, fireflies, electrical anomalies, anything but what my gut told me they were. 3 months into my return to driving, I was making a run through eastern Montana when a familiar voice crackled over my CB. "Breaker 19 for that Blue Thunder. You got your ears on, Hank?" I hadn't heard that voice in nearly a year, but I recognized it instantly. The same gravelly rasp that had told me to empty my pockets before shooting me and leaving me for dead. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I snatched up the handset, thoughts racing. Should I respond? Ignore it? Call the police? "I know you're listening, truck driver," the voice continued. "Been watching you a long time now. You're a hard man to kill." My hand trembled as I pressed the transmit button. "What do you want?" A chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Just to say hello, and that I'll be seeing you again sooner or later. Maybe next time those pretty blue lights won't be interrupted." I pulled over, scanning the highway behind and ahead of me, searching for the white Ford pickup. Nothing but empty road stretched in both directions, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. "Where are you?" I demanded into the CB. "Closer than you think. Always closer than you think." The transmission ended with a burst of static. I tried to call him back, but there was no response. Just silence and the distant rumble of highway traffic. I called the police, reported the communication, gave them my location. They sent a patrol car, took my statement, promised to look into it. But we all knew it was futile. CB transmissions were virtually untraceable, and without knowing where he was broadcasting from, they had nothing to go on. That night, parked at a busy truck stop with security cameras and plenty of witnesses around, I finally pulled out the journal I'd been keeping since the shooting. In it, I documented everything: the attack, the recovery, the nightmares, the blue lights, and now this new contact. Looking over my entries, a pattern emerged that I hadn't noticed before. The sightings of blue lights, the feelings of being watched. They always seemed to occur near the anniversary of the shooting, or when I was passing through certain areas of Montana. Whatever this was, whether a deranged hunter who got his kicks from targeting truckers, or something more inexplicable tied to those blue lights in the forest, it wasn't over. Maybe it would never be over. I still drive trucks. But I'm more cautious now. I stick to the main roads, avoid detours, and I always keep a gun in the cab. The open road doesn't feel quite as free as it used to, but it's still my livelihood, my life. That night in Montana changed me. It reminded me that no matter how much we think we're in control, there's always an element of unpredictability out there. And sometimes, that unpredictability comes with a shotgun and a cold, calculating stare. I never found out who that man was or why he targeted me. Maybe it was random, or maybe he had a reason I'll never understand. But one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the fear and helplessness I felt in that clearing, and I'll never take the safety of the open road for granted again. Life goes on, and so does the road. But every time I pass a beat-up old Ford, I can't help but wonder if it's him, watching, waiting. And I grip the wheel a little tighter, knowing that out there in the vast expanse of America, danger can find you when you least expect it. And sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains at dusk, I catch glimpses of blue lights among the trees, keeping pace with my truck. I don't know if they're harbingers of death or some kind of protection. All I know is that they're watching, always watching, and someday I might find out why. Until then, I keep driving. Because that's what truckers do. We keep moving forward, no matter what darkness waits around the next bend.